No one really talks about what it's like when a dream dies. Not the whimsical kind that would be nice to fulfill one day, but the kind of dream you built your life around, the one that shaped your decisions, your sacrifices, and your sense of purpose. Maybe it was the career or business you thought would finally make sense of all your effort. Maybe it was the relationship you believed would make your life whole. Or maybe it was a vision of who you'd become, the confident, successful, fulfilled version of yourself. When that dream collapses, it doesn't leave visible wreckage. You can still get up, go to work, smile and laugh when needed, but something inside you is gone. An internal compass, self-confidence and the belief that life can be good again. You begin to feel detached from the world around you, as though you're watching your own life from a few feet back. Friends might tell you to move on or start fresh, made all the more painful by the world doing just that as you remember a lost past. But the loss you're experiencing isn't just circumstantial, it's existential. You're not only grieving what you wanted or had, you're grieving who you were or who you could have become while you still believed it was possible. We rarely use the word grief for that, but that's what it is, a quiet private mourning for a future lost. It's the death of an imagined life or a real one, and with it the death of a self that felt purposeful, capable, complete and connected to something larger. We don't have good words for this. It's not just sadness. Something is missing, perhaps never to be found again. More than a century ago, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrestled with this loss, and few people have written about it or lived it so directly. And in his struggle to understand his own losses, he left behind a map for navigating ours. Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen in 1813, a city of narrow cobble streets, misted harbours and towering spires. He grew up in a wealthy but deeply religious home, ruled by his father Michael, a man haunted by guilt. When Michael was young, he had worked as a shepherd on the Danish plains. One freezing afternoon, starving and desperate, he cursed God aloud. Years later, after becoming successful, Michael had become convinced that his single act had doomed his bloodline. During Soren's life, tragedy had already confirmed his father's fears, as 5 of his siblings died before reaching adulthood, and his mother died when he was just 21. The surviving household became a cold place. The days were filled with Bible readings, silence, and confession. There was the sense that every joy was tempered by religious discipline. Kierkegaard absorbed that atmosphere completely. In one of his journals, he described himself as the unhappiest man alive. He once wrote that his father's melancholy was the most terrible inheritance, and it left him with a paradoxical belief that he was both chosen by God and cursed by him. When he finally reached university, Soren tried to leave his family's shadow behind. He studied philosophy and theology. He embraced a busy social life and even performed comic monologues in student theatres. For a moment he seemed to have broken free of the darkness, and it was during this time that Kierkegaard would meet the woman who would shape the remainder of his life, Regine Olsen. Regine was beautiful, witty and full of life, the opposite of his inward, haunted nature. They struck up a romance, walking through the gardens of Copenhagen, writing long letters and falling in love. They soon became engaged. For the first time, Soren felt what he called a joy that does not tremble. But it wasn't to last. The closer the wedding approached, the more he panicked. He began to fear that his melancholy, his constant wrestling with God and self, would make him a terrible husband. He told himself that his true calling was solitude, that he was not meant for ordinary happiness. And so, in an act that would define the rest of his life, he broke off the engagement, abruptly and without full explanation. Soren believed he was acting out of moral integrity, sparing Regine a life of suffering. But privately, he never forgave himself. Regine went on to marry another man, and Kierkegaard spent the rest of his short life writing by candlelight, alone in a small apartment, filling page after page about despair, choice, faith, and the impossibility of living without contradiction. It was this lived experience of irrevocable loss that would lead him to his most penetrating work. By the time he died at just 42, his works would go on to fill more than 20 volumes, and almost every one of them, in some way, circled back to the same question. What happens when the self we thought we were collapses? As Kierkegaard's later years unfolded, that question became his obsession. Living alone in Copenhagen, estranged from Regine, alienated from the church he once defended, and physically frail, he turned inward. He wanted to understand why people could seem outwardly alive and successful, but feel inwardly hollow, why so many, himself included, carry a wound that would not heal. In 1849, Kierkegaard published a small book with the haunting title, The Sickness Unto Death. It wasn't about disease or dying, it was a work of diagnosis, his attempt to describe a condition he believed haunted every human being, the misery of being unable to live at peace with oneself. In his book, Søren tried to describe a kind of suffering that had no visible sign, a sickness of meaning rather than body. He called it despair, and he wrote that it was the sickness unto death, because the spirit can die long before the body does. To him, despair wasn't about external misfortune, it was about misalignment within the self. Kierkegaard believed that every human being is a synthesis, a balance of opposing forces. We are finite and infinite, bound by our bodies and circumstances, yet capable of imagining beyond them. We are temporal and eternal, living day to day in time, while also sensing we're part of something that transcends it. And we are necessity and possibility, shaped by what we cannot change, yet still able to choose and become something new. A healthy self, Kierkegaard said, holds these tensions together, grounded in reality, but open to transformation. When that balance breaks, despair appears. Kierkegaard wrote that the self is a relation that relates itself to itself. That is, we are a relationship between different aspects of our being. We continuously narrate, edit, and reinterpret our own lives. We live the story we tell about ourselves, the narrative of what kind of person we'll become, what kind of life we're meant to have. The danger lies when that relationship to oneself breaks down. When the story we've been telling collapses, something inside us falls with it. The distance between reality and the imagined self becomes unbearable. That gap, that misrelation between who we are and who we thought we'd be, is what Kierkegaard called despair. He described three primary forms of it. The first is the despair of not knowing you have a self. This is the person who drifts through life unexamined, content to play roles handed to them, the employee, the spouse, the parent, without ever asking who is actually living underneath. They're not in crisis yet because they've never looked closely enough to see one coming. The second is the despair of not wanting to be yourself. This is the pain of rejection turned inward, when you cannot forgive yourself for your failures or your story feels so far from what you had hoped for that you wish you could step out of it altogether. It's the despair of avoidance, the wish to escape reality. And the third despair, he said, is the despair of wanting to be yourself without reference to anything higher. This is the modern kind, the belief that we can define ourselves entirely through willpower, confidence, or image. It looks like success, but it's often loneliness and aimlessness. All three forms of despair share a common root, our refusal to face the truth. When a dream dies, a career, a marriage, a future, we are forced to shed the stories we've been telling ourselves and others, the fake identity we've built our life on, and to finally face reality. That's why grief feels so disorienting. It isn't just sadness, it's the death of an identity. Not only losing a dream, you're losing the person who was supposed to live that dream. And when that person dies, you're left asking, who am I now? For Kierkegaard, this is the real sickness of the spirit, the moment when the self no longer knows how to exist as itself. But understanding despair is not the same as escaping it. For Kierkegaard, despair wasn't just a concept, it was his reality, the defining loss of his life. The one that shaped everything that followed was Regine. When he ended their engagement, he did so under the guise of integrity. He told himself that his calling as a writer and his burden of melancholy would make him unfit for marriage. He imagined he was choosing truth over comfort, purpose over pleasure. But his journals, a mixture of guilt and self-justification, tell another story. They reveal a man tormented by doubt, unsure whether he'd made a moral sacrifice or simply fled intimacy out of fear. In public, Kierkegaard maintained the image of a disciplined Christian thinker. In private, he confessed to being consumed by regret. Every essay he wrote on faith, freedom, or love is haunted by Regine's absence. She became a symbol for the death of his dream. He wrote of a feeling that he had died with only a ghost of himself remaining to walk through the world, and that he had sacrificed the aesthetic for the ethical, but that the sacrifice had hollowed him out. When we lose something we've built our identity on, a relationship, a career, a dream, we often do what Kierkegaard did. We try to transform the pain into a meaningful story to make the experience more bearable. But this attempt to find meaning can become its own form of denial. Some scholars argue that Kierkegaard's tragedy was that he intellectualized his grief so completely that he couldn't live beyond it. He spent his life attempting to justify a loss as a way to survive it. He spent his final years railing against the established church, living in near isolation, convinced that the Danish clergy had betrayed Christianity's essence. To many, he seemed bitter. But in his own way, he was consistent. He believed that truth was worth more than peace. And yet, even in his final writings, the longing never disappears. He often returned to Regine, sometimes by name, sometimes as metaphor. In one entry, he imagined seeing her again and wrote simply, "If I had faith, I would believe that nothing is lost." It's one of his most human lines, the confession of a man who understood everything about despair, except how to escape it. He didn't overcome his grief, but he transformed it into insight and left behind a philosophy that admits the truth most people avoid. Some wounds don't close neatly, they stay open and we learn from them. Yet Kierkegaard also believed that despair, once recognized, could become something transformative. He didn't see it as a failure or weakness. He saw it as the starting point for genuine selfhood. He wrote that the cure for despair is not distraction, nor achievement, nor blind faith. It is the willingness to face the truth of your condition. He called this the leap of faith between what we are and what we might still become. It is the act of saying, "I accept who I am, and I remain open to something greater than my understanding." To will the self one truly is, as he put it, means no longer trying to be rescued by a fantasy. It means allowing the false image, the ideal, the persona, the dream, to die so that something real can emerge. Once the illusion collapses, what remains is stark reality. And for Kierkegaard, that's where freedom begins. He wrote that most people spend their lives avoiding despair because it feels like destruction, but to him, avoidance only deepens the sickness. When you stop running, when you finally sit still with your pain, you begin to see its purpose. Despair is what happens when life refuses to let you lie to yourself any longer. It's not the death of meaning, but the end of delusion. And in that honesty lies the first flicker of renewal, the courage to say, even without the dream, I will live. When Kierkegaard wrote about this, he was speaking as someone who had lost nearly everything: family, love, reputation, and still refused to call despair the final word. He saw the broken self not as a mistake, but as the raw material for the beginning of something true. We stop trying to create meaning entirely for our own achievements and accept that we find ourselves through connection to others, to purpose beyond personal success, to something larger than the isolated self. What does this mean in practice? Kierkegaard would say that once illusion falls away, the work becomes beautifully small. We stop searching for a grand revelation and start rebuilding through what he called repetition, the faithful return to simple, honest acts. He once wrote that purity of heart is to will one thing. After loss, that one thing doesn't have to be a vision or a mission. It can be something as modest as living truthfully for a single day. Kierkegaard was a philosopher wrestling with his own despair, not a therapist offering a recovery plan, but his insights about confronting loss and rebuilding the self point towards something practical. Not instructions he laid out, but implications we can draw from his work. If we translate his philosophy into everyday terms, what might it actually look like to live through the collapse of a dream? This begins with the acknowledgement of where we actually stand. I'm tired, I'm disappointed, I don't know what comes next, I've messed up my life. That honesty is how rebuilding begins. Then comes the work of showing up. Choose one obligation that still belongs to you and meet it fully. It might be caring for someone you love, completing a small task, or simply maintaining order in your immediate world. Kierkegaard saw this kind of repetition as a form of faith, a way of saying, I still believe life is worth engaging, even in fragments. Each completed act, however ordinary, becomes a brick in the foundation of a new self. Alongside this, allow curiosity to quietly replace ambition. What remains interesting now that the old dream is gone? What small things still catch your attention? It doesn't have to be profound. Take action on these. They could be the seeds of meaning replanting themselves. Kierkegaard talked about patience with the eternal, trusting in what yet cannot be seen. You don't need to see the whole path to take the next step. You only need to believe that moving forward is better than standing still. Each honest moment, each fulfilled duty, each curiosity, this is how life starts to gather shape again. Not through force or clarity, but through the accumulation of small, consistent actions. We may not be able to rebuild our old dream, but we can still build a new one. Kierkegaard once said that despair is the refusal to be oneself. So perhaps healing and rebuilding your life is nothing more than the slow, patient act of returning, not to who you were before the loss, but to who you could be going forward. The dream may be gone, but you and all of life's potential still remain. And that's where every new story begins.